The Canadian economy was, in almost every sense, a top national headline week to week in 2024. The Bank of Canada held its key interest rate at 5% for most of the year, only to drastically start cutting rates halfway through. Inflation stayed under 3% for the year, dipping to 1.9% just last month. Housing, specifically affordability, was the Canadian press's top news story of the year. And along with that came the growing debate over immigration and its impact on the Canadian economy. Joining me now to discuss these top headlines from 2024 is Concordia University's Dr. Moshe Lander. Dr. Lander, thank you very much for joining us.
Hello.
Starting with the BOC, what do you make of the oversized rate cut? Is this the right direction, or are we maybe creating a scenario where we tee up inflation in 2025?
I don't think we're going to see a return of inflation in 2025. Inflation, like you said, has been below 3%. It was 1.9%. Had we not experienced 2022 and 2023, I don't know that this would be a topic, because for the better part of the last 30 years, inflation would move within that 1% to 3% range. Nobody really cared. The Bank of Canada would adjust interest rates as they needed. And while it would cause some pain or some joy for some, depending on the direction, it wasn't a news story. I'm hoping that when we go into 2025, this story will go away, because inflation is not going to take off, at least because of the Bank of Canada's decisions. There might be other looming issues on the horizon that might cause it, but it's not the Bank of Canada. They've done everything that they were supposed to do. I would take exception with their 50 basis point cut at their last meeting. I would have maybe done 25 basis points and held onto that extra quarter of a percentage point into next year. But if they want to use it now, it's just a timing issue more than a quantitative issue.
Do you think that maybe limits the options available to them in 2025?
That's exactly why I would have held on to it. It does limit their options. And if the economy does slow, if there's tariffs, if there's all kinds of other issues that surface, they maybe have one full percentage point worth of cuts left. How they want to portion that out, say 4 25 basis point cuts, that's entirely up to them. But yeah, it would have been nice if they had 1.25 percentage point cuts.
Yeah, a little more of a path to accommodate. What about the dollar? How does this impact the Canadian dollar? I mean, last week, the dollar significantly dipped. Is this something that's going to continue to devalue the dollar? And where do you see this going in 2025?
It could. It was one of the main causes of the dollar falling through the year when the Bank of Canada diverged from the US Federal Reserve on interest rate cuts. The falling dollar was the natural consequence of that. The Fed will at some point get around to cutting interest rates. They will slowly converge on Canada. Like I said, they only have 1 percentage point left really to cut. So the Fed has more room to cut, which means they will come down to our level or around our level. The dollar will strengthen then on that particular news. But remember that in Canada, we have a flexible exchange rate. It goes up, it goes down. 15 years ago, we were talking about how our dollar was stronger than the US one.
Yeah.
And about 25 years ago, two hockey teams left this country, at least in part because the Canadian dollar was so low.
There are a bunch of people in Quebec and Winnipeg who are feeling the pain with that comment. I mean, you mentioned leaving the country, the dollar. What about tariffs? I mean, we don't know whether or not that issue will be resolved prior to January 20th. But what is the impact of 25% tariffs across the board if Donald Trump follows through?
Well, I don't think, David, that it's going to be resolved before January 20. I think even the Canadian government has acknowledged it's going to be there. It's just an issue now of how long it's going to be around. I think it's important, too, to note that in that text that Trump sent out, he did say that there was an off-ramp. It was fix the fentanyl shipments and fix the immigrants crossing the border. And so it's not inherently that we're going to have to deal with tariffs indefinitely. It's fix these two issues, at least to his satisfaction, and the tariffs in theory should go away. It's not going to be good news for Canada the longer they hang around. It's going to lead to a recession. It's going to lead to higher unemployment. It could lead to even Canadian businesses just leaving the country and moving operations elsewhere to avoid having to deal with the tariffs or future tariffs.
And do we have any idea or any forecast of what the economic impact would actually be? We have about 45 seconds before we go to break. Or do we not know what the actual impact would be because it's still too soon to try and calculate that?
Yeah, we don't know. It depends on how long those tariffs last. The thing that we do know is that the GDP figures for October came out earlier today. It was a 0.3 percentage point growth, which is good, but it means that we really are teetering near a recession. So I would assume that the broad generalization is it's going to lead to a recession.
Yeah, the straw that breaks the camel's back. We do have to go to commercial, but when we come back, I want to talk housing and immigration because, at least politically, those two topics have overlapped in terms of the national debate on both. So stay with us. We will have more when we come back right after the commercial. We're back. I'm joined by Dr. Moshe Lander. Dr. Lander, before the break, we mentioned housing. It was the top story, according to the Canadian press. Just how unaffordable is housing in Canada in comparison to, let's say, other peer jurisdictions? And what are the main factors at play here that's created this problem and had it last for so long?
You know, the rough rule of thumb was that you should be spending about a third of your income on housing. I think most Canadians will now say that they're spending closer to 40, 50%.
Hmm.
And you'll find anecdotal evidence, particularly in really messed up markets like Toronto or Vancouver, where you could hear as much as 90% of their
Yeah.
disposable income being spent on housing. So it's clearly an issue, and it's been an issue that's been increasingly problematic for years and years now. It's not something that just surfaced in 2024. I think maybe things finally came to a head here. The biggest problem at the end of the day is it's a mismatch between supply and demand. When we talk about housing unaffordability, there are people that are buying these homes, right? So there's not a stock of housing that's going unsold. It's just that the amount that people are having to spend, or where they're trying to come up with that money, or what they're having to cut back on to try and be able to
Yeah.
make those payments, is just too messed up. A lot of that problem does not rest with the federal government. It doesn't even rest with provincial governments. It mostly rests at the municipal level where housing is their jurisdiction.
Hmm.
If they create more liberal zoning laws, if they allowed for home builders who are anxious to put shovels in the ground to actually mass produce, I think a lot of this problem would go away. It's just that there's a NIMBY sort of attitude among homeowners, where in Canada we were told owning a home is the greatest thing you can aspire to, and
Yeah.
it's their biggest asset, if not their pension. And so what they do is they lobby local governments, don't create liberal zoning laws in my neighborhood, find somewhere else to do it. And of course, nobody ever agrees to their neighborhood being the destination.
We might be crossing from the economic to the political a little bit with this one, but is there a role to play for either the federal government and or the provincial government to try and combat that NIMBYism?
I think the only lever that they have is to threaten to withhold funds to municipalities that don't meet certain targets. And
Hmm.
that's about the extent of it. So much of our federal dollars get transferred to the provinces, and then those provincial dollars get transferred down to municipalities. So instead of just handing it over without conditions, if you want to start tying conditions saying you have to meet certain targets for whether it's
Yeah.
housing prices or building construction levels, fine. I don't know necessarily that they want to get involved in that, because once you start setting those targets, it changes the incentive of what people are trying to accomplish. It's now merely a matter of, we'll just achieve those targets. And what they might be building isn't necessarily what people actually want.
Yeah, they may overbuild in certain housing categories and be underserved in others. What do you make of those who think that the housing crisis is an immigration problem? Not my words, but it's certainly perpetuated out there by others. That we just have let too many people in, and they increase the demand for housing, and that's the reason we're in this mess.
They are a source of demand. It's impossible to ignore that, but to lay it at their feet and say that they're responsible for it, what exactly did they do wrong? They came to the country, they wanted a place to live. How do we blame them for that? To say go
Yeah.
back where you came from because you want a place to live is wrong as well. The biggest issue was that the provinces and municipalities almost seemed caught by surprise that the federal government was allowing immigrants in. So if the federal government was going to increase their levels of immigration, did they communicate to the provinces and to the
Hmm.
municipalities that you're going to need to make sure it's not just housing, but also social services, right? You need doctors, you need schools, you need roads and infrastructure and
Yeah.
uh, jobs, and so I think the biggest issue was just it was a mismatch. Sending them back sends a dangerous signal that we're not welcoming of immigrants. That's something that could last a generation, but it's also something too then that could cause medium to long-term damage, where at some point we are going to need workers. We're not just creating enough population growth on our own. So where's it going to come from, especially as boomers really start to reach that peak retirement period?
Uh, we have about a minute left. I want to give you the magic eight ball here. What does 2025 look like from a macroeconomic standpoint? Where is Canada going to be? Let's say we have this conversation again in a year's time.
It's not going to be a good 2025 for Canada. When we have a recession, let's keep in mind that it's not that the economy is going to tank 10%, 20%, 30%. It's going to tank 1 or 2 percentage points.
Mhm.
And the good news is that the economy always bounces back. But just to go up, sometimes you do have to come down. And we're going to see that 2025 is a down period. While interest rates will come down, inflation will stay low, GDP will shrink, unemployment will rise, and we're going to have to deal with those tariffs and potential 2026 issues related to renegotiating the free trade agreement again.
Yeah, yeah. Another very big negotiating point is USMCA, it being up for renewal, and all that goes into that. Dr. Lander, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Anytime, talk to you in the new year.
We'll be right back after this quick commercial.